There is no farewell long enough to make a narcissist truly understand you, not because you didn't explain clearly enough, deeply enough, or sincerely enough, but because in a relationship with them, words were never the deciding factor. What they read is not the content, but the signal. Whether you are still there, whether you are still reacting, whether your emotions are still being pulled into their world. That is why every time you try to explain, to lay things out, or to end things properly, you are not bringing them any closer to the truth. You are unintentionally confirming that you are still within their sphere of influence. The more you speak, the more you remain, and as long as you remain, the system continues to operate. But there is a way of saying goodbye that makes that entire structure unable to continue as it once did. Not because it is cold, harsh, or forceful, but because it withdraws the one thing that keeps everything alive: your participation. The moment you stop trying to be understood, stop needing validation, stop returning to clarify or repair the story, the very anchor they once relied on to orient themselves begins to lose its grip. What destabilizes them is not losing you as a person, but losing the psychological support that allowed them to feel everything was still under control. And here lies the paradox. The farewell that creates the greatest aftershock is not the longest, most emotional, or most reasonable one, but the farewell that is delivered only once, not repeated, not prolonged, not left open, not to make them understand, and not to make them change, but to decisively close your role within that system. It is precisely your refusal to return and explain that creates the void. It is the consistent silence after that farewell that leaves the old structure disoriented. And it is this withdrawal, rather than any set of words, that makes it impossible for things to return to the way they were. This is something that must be understood with absolute precision, because if it is misunderstood, the entire power of the goodbye disappears from the very beginning. The goodbye message here is not a message meant to communicate something, not a final explanation, and certainly not an attempt to achieve closure and peace the way society teaches us. In essence, it is the moment you change your existential position within the relationship, and it is that shift alone that creates a deep and irreversible impact. When you explain yourself, no matter how calm or compassionate your tone may be, you are still implicitly acknowledging that the other person has the right to understand you, the right to be guided through your emotions, and the right to continue occupying space in your inner world. When you argue, you are still accepting a playing field whose rules are designed to ensure the game never ends. When you accuse, you are still attaching your emotions to them. And when you leave the door open for feedback, even by the smallest crack, you are still leaving behind a thread of connection that allows the old system to self-repair and continue operating. The goodbye we are talking about does none of these things, because its goal was never to be understood, validated, or proven right, but to completely terminate your role within that structure. It does not explain, because explanation is a form of self-justification, and you only justify yourself when you still feel the need for the other person's recognition. It does not argue, because argument is a sign of an attachment that is still alive, where every response continues to feed the loop. It does not accuse, because accusation is still a way of holding on, a way of saying, "You hurt me." And as long as you need them to know that, you are still granting them power. It does not invite feedback, because feedback is the ignition point for return, for rewriting the story, for the familiar cycles of apology, denial, and promises. This goodbye does not aim to close the story in a beautiful way. It ends the function of that story within your psychological life. For this reason, the goodbye message should not be understood as words, but as an act of ending. That act is expressed through emotional clarity, through leaving no room for interpretation, no ambiguity, no double meanings, no hidden hope. It is clear because ambiguity is fertile ground for manipulation, for the other person to continue writing the story in a way that benefits them. It is neutral Because emotion, whether love or anger, is still a form of participation, still energy supplied to a system that survives on your reactions. Neutrality does not mean numbness. It means you no longer place your emotions in the other person's hands for them to touch, trigger, or distort. It is unconditional, because every condition is a disguised promise of maybe one day, and it is that very maybe that keeps you in their mind and keeps them in yours. It contains no promise of later, because a vague future is precisely where old loops multiply, where hope and doubt intertwine to pull you back into the old role. When there is no longer a later, no when, no if, that system loses the axis of time around which it revolves, and disorientation begins. The most important and also the most difficult point for deeply empathetic people lies here. The power of the goodbye message does not lie in the moment you send it, but in how you live afterward. You may write a perfect sentence, but if you return to explain, respond, or monitor their reaction, the entire act of ending collapses on itself. Conversely, you may say very little, so little that outsiders might think it is not enough. But if afterward you withdraw consistently, do not react, do not repair, do not turn back, it is that consistency that causes the old structure to fall apart. Because in that moment, the other person does not only lose you, they lose the psychological anchor that once made their existence feel meaningful. They no longer have someone to reflect them, no one to trigger emotions, no one to argue with or manipulate, and no one to blame. That void cannot be filled with words, because words no longer have an entry point. This is why a goodbye message is not something to copy and paste, but a living boundary, a decision expressed through action, through sovereign silence, and through truly stepping out of that system. When you understand this at a deep level, you will no longer worry about how to write it correctly, because you will realize that what determines everything is not the wording you choose, but the person you become after that goodbye. Have you ever wondered why, even after you spoke very clearly, even after you were exhausted to the point of having nothing left to give, the other person still would not let go, still tried to return, still left ambiguous signs that made you waver between leaving and staying? Have you ever experienced the sense that the moment you went silent, they became restless, uncomfortable, or suddenly reappeared with a message that was not exactly loving but was enough to pull you back into old patterns of thought? These experiences are not random, and they are not because you were not decisive enough. They exist because narcissism does not operate on ordinary emotions the way we assume. It survives on a very specific type of fuel, and its entire structure is built around seeking, maintaining, and protecting that fuel at all costs. Narcissism is not nourished by love, nor does it live on healthy attachment. What feeds it is attention, emotional reactions, and the psychological presence of others. Every time you explain, you provide attention. Every time you feel pain, anger, or disappointment because of them, you provide emotional reaction. Every time you return to make things clear or to close things properly, you give them something even more important than words, your presence in their inner world. That presence is the core fuel. Without it, everything begins to decay from the inside. This explains why a narcissist may appear completely indifferent to the content of the story, yet highly sensitive to whether you are still reacting. They may not remember what you said, but they remember very clearly how you cried, how angry you became, how many times you returned. To them, your emotions are not a shared experience, but a resource that makes them feel substantial, influential, central to the narrative. As long as that resource flows, the narcissistic structure remains operational. When it is cut off, the entire system begins to suffocate. That is why the goodbye we discussed earlier has an impact not because it is right or well written, but because it interrupts that flow of fuel. When you do not explain, you refuse to provide attention. When you do not argue, you refuse to provide emotional reaction. When you do not accuse, you refuse to grant them the central role in your pain. And when you do not open the door to feedback, you cut off the only path through which the fuel could return. What disorients them is not losing you as a specific person, but losing the ability to activate and exploit you as a source of psychological nourishment. There is a subtle point here that many people miss. A narcissist does not need you to love them. They only need you to remain relevant to them. Relevant through hope, through anger, through curiosity, through the need to be understood, even through unresolved pain. Any of these states keeps the connection alive. And as long as that connection is alive, the system retains the ability to self-patch, self-adjust, and continue operating. This is why long, emotional, reasoned goodbyes often fail to end anything, and instead become emotional reserves that are reused later. When you understand what narcissism feeds on, you begin to see why a goodbye message cannot be a conversation, cannot be a mutual understanding, and certainly cannot be a prolonged explanation. Each of those elements inadvertently fuels what you are trying to leave behind. In contrast, measured clarity, emotional neutrality, and consistency after the goodbye are what gradually drain the fuel, not immediately, not dramatically, but in a way that cannot be reversed. When there are no reactions to exploit, no emotions to activate, and no presence to cling to, narcissism is forced to face the inner void it has always avoided. And it is precisely that moment when the system truly begins to crack, not because of anything you do to them, but because you stop supplying what has sustained them all along. And when that fuel begins to run out, something very different from what you may have been told occurs. There is no beautiful awakening, no moment where they understand everything, and no deep transformation like the ones you once hoped for during earlier attempts to stay. What happens first is disorientation. A narcissist is not accustomed to existing without reflection, not accustomed to silence without reaction, and certainly not accustomed to no longer occupying the central role in someone else's emotional world. When you withdraw consistently, the system does not collapse immediately. It begins to malfunction. They search for you in familiar gaps, wait for familiar signals, familiar reactions, and when those do not come, unease quietly builds in layers. At this stage, many people misunderstand what they are seeing. They notice prolonged silence or a few unusual movements and begin to wonder whether their goodbye was not strong enough or not clear enough. In reality, that silence itself is evidence that the fuel has been cut. A narcissist who is still being fed does not go silent in that way. They provoke, stir, and test reactions. Only when there is nothing left to cling to they drift into a suspended state, where old strategies no longer produce familiar results. What disturbs them most is not that you left, but that you are no longer there to confirm their existence. From here, a chain of inner reactions begins, even if you no longer see it. Without you as a mirror, they are forced back toward themselves, precisely where narcissism has always tried to avoid. Not because there is nothing inside, but because what is there is unintegrated, unaccepted, and has never been faced directly. When you were present, they could continuously push those parts outward, assign them to you, to the relationship, to circumstances. When you withdraw, that mechanism loses its support. This is why many narcissists become more irritable, more unstable, or rush to find new replacements immediately after you leave. Not because they have forgotten you, but because they are panicking to find another fuel source to fill the void that has just opened. What matters is this: their search for another source does not invalidate your goodbye. On the contrary, it is a sign that the goodbye has struck the right place. A replacement may temporarily soothe the sense of lack, but it rarely fills the position you once held, because that position was not merely a person, but a familiar psychological function. And it is the silent comparison between the old feeling and the new source that keeps the system unstable over time. You do not need to know this, follow it, or witness it. The impact of your withdrawal occurred the moment you did not return. Conversely, this is also the greatest test for you. When there is no longer communication and no longer any response, the empathic part of you can easily rise up with familiar questions. Am I being too cold? Should I say one more sentence to make things clearer? Am I abandoning them when they need someone the most? But those very questions are traces of the old role you once carried, the role of the regulator, the one who kept everything from falling apart. If you return at this stage, even with a single short message, the system will immediately revive because the fuel has returned. On the other hand, if you remain with that silence, endure the initial emptiness, you are completing the act of ending that the previous section described. And it is precisely here that a quiet but profound shift occurs. When you no longer participate, no longer react, no longer place yourself in the position of having to understand or rescue, your psychological energy begins to return to you. You may not be able to name it right away, but you will feel it through very small changes. Your mind spins less. Your emotions are no longer yanked without warning, and silences begin to carry a different quality. It is not immediate relief, but the sense that you are no longer suspended inside a story that was never truly yours. This is why this goodbye, though painful at first and difficult to hold, opens an entirely different process for you, one in which peace does not come from the other person changing, but from you, no longer having to nourish a structure that exhausted you. If you look at this entire process as a continuous sequence, you will see that the goodbye message is not the moment you say something, but the moment you stop supplying fuel to what has been living off you. Narcissism does not collapse because it is attacked, exposed, or punished, but because it cannot exist in a void where there are no reactions left to exploit. And it is your quiet, consistent, no turning back withdrawal that makes that void permanent. And then, at a point that is very difficult to name, you begin to realize that the deepest change is not in them, but in you. When you are no longer pulled into the familiar reaction loop, your nervous system gradually exits a state of constant vigilance. You no longer wait for a message to feel okay, no longer analyze every small sign to guess whether you still have influence, and no longer feel the need to prove that your decision to leave was right. This sounds simple, but in reality it marks a major turning point. You are no longer living inside a relationship that has ended, but inside a new inner life that is being rebuilt. In the space that used to be filled with anxiety, hope, and unanswered questions, a different kind of order begins to form slowly but steadily. You begin to distinguish what is truly your emotion and what is residual echo from the old system, what is sadness that needs to be allowed, and what is the urge to go back simply to avoid temporary emptiness. Conversely, what many people do not see, but what unfolds quietly, is the growing contradiction inside the narcissistic structure when the fuel does not return. It does not always show on the surface, and it does not always lead them to reach out again. Sometimes, what is most terrifying for them is not being rejected, but having no one left to reject or manipulate. When there is no response, every familiar strategy loses its effect. When there is no audience, the stories they tell themselves begin to lose persuasive force. This is where inner instability increases, not dramatically, but as a slow burn, prolonged. And it is precisely that prolongation that prevents the system from returning to its original state, because there is no anchor left to re-establish the old loop. What matters is that you do not need to witness, confirm, or fully understand what is happening on the other side for this process to continue. In fact, the more you try to look back, monitor, or decode, the more you place yourself back into the old role. The power of the goodbye you sent does not lie in what reaction it produces, but in the fact that it no longer needs a reaction to have value. When you stop seeking answers from them, you begin answering more important questions for yourself. Why you stayed so long, why you carried emotional responsibility for someone else, and why withdrawal makes you feel both painful and relieved at the same time. Those questions no longer point outward, they turn inward, where real maturity begins. And here, a very blunt truth must be stated. Not everyone who leaves completes this act of ending. Many people say goodbye with their mouth, but remain with their mind. They do not text, but they still imagine, still replay conversations that never happened, still wait for a moment of realization from the other side. In that case, the fuel may no longer flow outward, but it is still being burned inside them. The goodbye becomes complete only when you not only withdraw from the relationship, but also withdraw from the old role inside yourself, the role of the fixer, the carrier, the one who keeps everything from collapsing. When that role ends, you no longer need someone else to collapse to prove you were right. You only need to feel that you are no longer being pulled off center from your own core. At this point, the goodbye is no longer a moment of grief. It becomes a marker of transformation. It does not take revenge, does not teach anyone a lesson, and does not carry any hidden message. It is simply a survival decision for your inner integrity. And when you look back at the whole journey, you will see that what makes a narcissist unable to recover is not that you hurt them, but that you no longer participate in feeding a structure that never had the capacity to love the way you love. And it is precisely here that a very common misunderstanding begins to appear. Many people believe that the rupture will eventually lead to change, awakening, or at least a better version of the other person. But the truth runs counter to that intuition, because some structures do not collapse in order to be repaired. They collapse because they were never designed to stand on their own. What you must face directly is the operating nature of narcissism. Narcissism is not like a person in crisis who simply needs time to recover, nor like a psychological wound that can be healed with enough love. It is a psychological survival system built around a single principle. There must always be external input to maintain a sense of existence. Everything you once called the relationship emotion, attachment, shared history at a deeper level revolved around you providing attention, reaction, and presence to keep that system running smoothly. When you are there, the system functions. When you withdraw, it does not shift into self-repair. It falls into dysregulation. This is the point where many people get confused and blame themselves. They see the other person become more unstable, more disordered, sometimes even appearing remorseful or trying to change. And they begin to wonder whether they are too harsh, too cold, or leaving at the wrong time. But in reality, those expressions are not signs of healing. They are reflexes of a system trying to patch the lost supply, not rebuild from within. Narcissism cannot self-stabilize without external input, because it never learned how to endure inner emptiness without filling it through others. For that reason, the idea of repair, in this case, is an illusion. To repair, a structure must be able to recognize its own lack, take responsibility for its instability, and remain with emptiness long enough for a new order to form. But narcissism runs in the opposite direction. It is programmed to avoid that emptiness at all costs. When you are no longer there, it does not turn inward to restructure. It turns outward to find a new anchor. If it finds one, the system temporarily stabilizes on the surface. If it does not, instability continues, not leading to change, but to hardening, defensiveness, and blame. This is why your goodbye creates a state of beyond repair. Not because you destroyed them, and not because you did something wrong, but because you withdrew the only factor that ever allowed that system to function. When that factor disappears, there is no internal mechanism strong enough to replace it. The efforts that follow apologies, returning, appearing better, or even finding someone new are only ways of prolonging the system's survival, not true healing. They are like propping up a building that has no foundation with temporary supports. It may look stable for a moment, but it never returns to its original state. What you need to understand, so you do not return to the old role, is that this collapse is not a call for you to come back and rescue. It is the inevitable consequence of a structure dependent on external input being cut off. When you leave and do not return, you are not blocking their healing. You are simply no longer carrying the part they never carried themselves. And because no one is carrying it anymore, the system cannot recover in the old way. It either clings to another source or exists in prolonged instability, but it cannot return to the shape it had when you were still there. This is also why holding your withdrawal is what decides everything. Not so they learn a lesson, not so they change, but so your act of ending is completed fully. When you understand that the structure cannot be repaired from the outside, you will no longer be pulled back by guilt or by the vague hope that one more time will make things different. You do not leave because they are not worthy. You leave because you recognize that some systems exist only when someone else sacrifices their own integrity to keep them standing. And the moment you stop sacrificing, that moment, everything passes the threshold of recovery. But right there, a very instinctive question often arises in the listener's mind. If it is beyond repair, why do they still come back? This question makes many people waver, doubt their decision, and sometimes return at the exact moment when the ending process should be completed. So the next part is not to deny what has just been analyzed, but to clarify an important paradox. They may come back, but they never stay. The first thing to understand is that a narcissist's return is not evidence of love, remorse, or inner change, but a survival reflex of a system that has just lost its familiar source of nourishment. When you withdraw and do not return, the void that appears is not only in the relationship, but in their very sense of existence. Their return at that point is like an instinctive reach to check whether the old fuel source is still there, whether the door you once left open is truly closed or merely ajar. It does not come from an intention to stay long-term, but from the need to reduce inner panic and restore the sense of control that was interrupted. That is why the way they return often carries very familiar features. Vague apologies, not tied to specific responsibility, beautiful memories brought up to trigger old emotion, or a victim posture used to reverse the power position. Those moves are not meant to build a healthier new relationship. They are meant to test one thing only. Are you still reacting? If you react even with anger, explanation, or simply replying, the fuel returns immediately, and the old system has a chance to re-establish itself. If you do not react, that return quickly loses momentum because it fails to achieve its initial survival goal. The key point is this. A narcissist may return many times, but every return lacks the essential condition for staying, namely, a relationship no longer built on power and reaction. Once you have truly withdrawn, you no longer provide what once kept that system stable. Emotional regulation, willingness to explain, and constant psychological presence. In a space like that, they cannot remain for long, because staying means facing the inner emptiness they previously avoided through others. So their return is always short-term, surface level, and colored more by testing than by commitment. This also explains why many people get confused when they see the return and conclude that nothing has ended. In reality, the very act of returning shows that the system has lost stability and is trying to patch itself, not heal. A healthy system, when it ends, withdraws in silence and restructures from within. A dependent system, when it loses its source, returns to try to restore that source. The two movements may look similar from the outside, but the inner motive is entirely different. And this is the most important point for the listener. Their return does not invalidate your goodbye unless you step back into the old role. If you maintain non-reaction, no explanation, no dialogue, then every return only makes it clearer that the structure cannot exist without you propping it up. Conversely, if you return even once, even with the intention of just making things clear, the system immediately has an opportunity to revive. So the power is not in whether they come back or not. It is in whether you are still an anchor or not. When you see this whole process soberly, you will understand that beyond repair does not mean they disappear forever or never reach out again. It means the old relationship no longer has the capacity to be rebuilt in the form it once had, unless you voluntarily return to the role that exhausted you. And when you do not, each time they return and then retreat is only a failed loop, further reinforcing the truth that the system cannot stay in a space where you have withdrawn all of your energy back to yourself. In the end, what matters most is not whether they come back or not, how panicked they become, or how they attempt to patch their system together. All of those movements belong to their inner world, a world in which you no longer have any responsibility to remain, to decipher, or to carry. The truth that needs to be placed back in its proper position is this: the moment you deliver a true goodbye and do not return, you step out of a structure that existed only through your participation. You do not break them. You simply stop holding that system upright with your own energy. The goodbye message we have spoken about throughout this journey was never a sentence meant to hurt, nor a maneuver designed to make someone collapse. It is simply the moment you return to each person what belongs to them. You return to them the responsibility of facing their own inner emptiness, and you return to yourself the right to live without regulating, fixing, or carrying responsibility for another person's emotions. When you understand this, you are no longer shaken by whether they return or disappear, because neither is any longer a measure of your worth or your decision. You may not receive acknowledgement. There may be no complete apology, and there may be no beautiful ending like the one you once hoped for. But in exchange, you gain something far deeper: inner integrity. You no longer live in a state of waiting for reactions, no longer hang suspended in a story that was never truly told for you, and no longer sacrifice your peace to keep a distorted structure alive. That goodbye, therefore, does not close your heart, it frees it from a role that exhausted you for far too long. And if there is one thing to be etched in at this final point, it is this: real power does not lie in saying something that shatters another person, but in being lucid enough to withdraw and not turn back. When you no longer reflect, no longer react, and no longer participate, what cannot stand on its own will collapse by itself. And you, for the first time, do not leave to escape, but leave to return to yourself.